Star Wars video games have been in a bit of a weird spot recently, which maybe that's reflective of the franchise as a whole right now, which is also in kind of a weird spot. I think you have big hits like the Jedi games, which I think are excellent games. However, I do think I think most of the Star Wars games that come out these days are sort of missing a little charm. And for a while, I didn't really know where to pinpoint it. Because, I mean, it's really easy to pin it all on nostalgia. I mean, I would say most people are pretty nostalgic about some Star Wars game or another. Whether it's Lego Star Wars, the classic Battlefront games, Shadows of the Empire, or Dark Forces, if you're a real old. Sorry if I'm calling out some people, but people are really nostalgic for these games. And while that, I think, does impact some of it, obviously you're never going to be nostalgic about the Jedi games or the modern Battlefronts the same way, I think. They're good games, but I feel like we've lost something in a couple ways. I think to start, the biggest thing I want to just go ahead and say is I love the Jedi games. Both Fallen Order and Survivor, fantastic games. I think they do a great job at sort of capturing mass appeal from like Star Wars fans and being a game that really any Star Wars fan can kind of hop in and sort of enjoy it at a casual level or at a higher level, which that was obviously the goal with them, and I think they succeeded. I think they're great, and it satisfied me both as a video game and how fun it was to play. I'd say I'm a fairly above average gamer, so I was able to get a decent challenge out of it on the higher difficulties, and it was very approachable for people who are not really big gamers but just like Star Wars and wanted to get Star Wars video game experience, like a story experience out of that. I think it succeeded, but I think they needed to do that for the Jedi games because the budgets are bonkers for these Star Wars games these days. If you look at the EA Battlefronts, if you look at the Jedi games, and even more recently Star Wars Hunters, they be blowing more billions on these games. And they have massive development cycles. And I think that's okay. But I do think it's a little unsustainable. I want to also preface by saying this could definitely be some Disney shenanigans. They could be pricing the IP rights at a very high number to the point to where to even recoup they just need to aim big and go wide, cast a wide net, if that makes any sense. So maybe this is not as feasible as I would hope it was, but I think we need some craziness back in Star Wars games. And you may be asking, well, what in the hell does that mean? What it means for me is I want to see Star Wars games start implementing some crazy mechanics again. Some interesting new ideas. This is sort of what they were doing back in this era. They were just kind of giving anybody the Star Wars rights and saying, if you want to make an interesting game that's Star Wars, go right ahead. And we got a lot of interesting games because of it in this time period. For better or for worse, we got Battlefront, that was awesome. We got Star Wars Republic Commando. We got The Force Unleashed. So many amazing games. I mean, we also got, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. So, not all wins. And that game probably, it isn't even that bad. Like, it's fine. It's basically like a discount F-Zero. I think the real kicker with a lot of the Star Wars multimedia stuff from this era that I think makes all of them feel kind of special is that a lot of them, there's a lot of variety between all of them. And I think what makes that work is because none of them really overstay their welcome. I've replayed a bunch of them fairly recently, a bunch of these older Star Wars games, and sort of like, it was mostly for nostalgia reasons, but also I kind of wanted to see how some of them held up. And it's a bit of a mixed bag, but all of them I think were pretty enjoyable experiences, and I think it's for a couple of reasons. I think they didn't try to do too much and be too much in a lot of cases. And I think they executed on their gimmick fairly well. Let's start with Star Wars Republic Commando. I think this game is one of my favorites of this bunch that I'm going to talk about here. Actually, it is my favorite of the bunch I'm going to talk about here. And this is where I think some bias might come in, but I don't really care. I'm going to talk about it anyways. I think this game is a really cool idea. Basically, the Republic Commando whole shtick, the gimmick, if you will, is the ability to command your squad mates. The gunplay in the game is fairly decent. The combat is fairly good. It's nothing crazy for the time, but it's enjoyable. But really what makes it stand out is the ability to actually command your squad mates to do specific things, and especially dynamically, like in fights. So they would design arenas and enemy placements with the idea that you're able to put different people doing different things. Like, you may not have the ammo, but your squad mates might if you're able to get them in position. And then being able to revive them, it was a really, really cool mechanic. I think it was executed very well, and I think they did a good job of expanding upon that over the course of the game, making it quite challenging. And I liked that all of the enemies had they required some unique thinking to get around in a lot of cases. And it kind of added a little more of a puzzle element to each, I guess, combat experience that they throw at you. And like I said, I think the biggest success of this game, and the reason I think it works, is because it doesn't overstay its welcome. And sure, I don't think their multiplayer is anything to really write home about, quite honestly. I mean, the game wasn't designed around that at all. I think when you remove the main mechanic of the game, I think it goes to show that when you remove the gimmick, it's not all too special. It's fine, sure, but it's not all too special. I know they just added it just to keep it in line with most FPS games of the era. Like, well, we gotta add a multiplayer. But really what makes it special is the squad mechanics and commanding your squad mates. I think it's very well done. And I haven't really seen a game really execute on this kind of control really since, especially not in a more casual. Really, I've only seen it executed in like TAC FPS settings. Like, I believe you can do some similar stuff in like Ready or Not or in SWAT. You don't really see this gimmick really reused, and not that I necessarily think it should, but I think it goes to show that coming up with a novel, I guess I'm using this to sort of get into my point of, it would be really interesting to go back to for the Star Wars franchise, especially in games, is to go back to making a video game that first has cool gameplay with a novel, fun concept or gimmick or fun gameplay mechanic, building a pretty tight experience around that game. I think there's no reason to make the game too much or have a crazy amount of broad appeal, but keep the scope small and the experience well paced, and I think you've got a recipe for success, especially if you can do it on a budget, release it at a fairly cheap price point. I think that would be a really cool way to see Star Wars games move forward and be able to get crazier with their ideas again, because most Star Wars games these days, I think, play it a little too broad, a little too safe, in trying to get mass Star Wars fan appeal, which, when your budget is super high, this makes a lot of sense. I think it even is what you have to do in these scenarios. But if you're able to keep the budget lower, I think you can make some more interesting experiences, actually, because you're not constrained by the need for it to sell a bajillion copies. It's kind of the Nintendo strategy of, like, make some games that are quicker turnaround time. You don't spend 5 years making a game. It's more like 2 or 3. You get it out. It's a cool, novel idea. It sells okay. It sells pretty well. But they end up still making money on it because they didn't spend an exorbitantly large amount of money to begin with on it. And obviously this doesn't apply to stuff like Breath of the Wild. This is more to, like, I guess, Mario spin-off games, which, not that I necessarily need Star Wars super sluggers out here. Yes, to get into my next game that I like to talk about here, Star Wars Bounty Hunter. This game is something else. The main gimmick for Star Wars Bounty Hunter is really just playing as Jango Fett. That's kind of what the entire game is built around. Something that has been they tried to do it again and base a game around a Mandalorian, and I think it could be successful again. I recall, sadly, I mean, there's Star Wars 1313, there's now Respawn's canceled Mandalorian game. I don't know why teams are having such a hard time making a Mandalorian focused game like that, because quite honestly, I think making a Mandalorian game in the style of the Jedi games is also another money printer, mass appeal type game franchise they could do if they're really going for these more AAA experiences like that. I think really can't believe that that concept hasn't worked out for them yet. Even on a smaller scale, you can still make something like this work, and Bounty Hunter, I think, does, for the time, a pretty good job. Not groundbreaking by any means, but I think it does a good job of kind of fulfilling that fantasy. There's a place for these kind of games, I think, in the market, as long as the budget is not, they don't spend too much on the game, keep it fairly quick, fairly small, maybe keep the price, like have the starting price a little lower. I think like a $40 price tag, I think that could be really cool. I think that would be something that would have a lot of appeal. I feel like they tried to encapsulate a lot of ideas, but I think this is maybe one of the more counterpoints of this entire strategy, which is because of the lower budget and development time. Sometimes in a situation like this, they're not able to fully capture what they're going for here. And I feel like in Bounty Hunter especially, they were able to give Jango Fett all the abilities they wanted him to have, but they kind of lacked the time to really flesh out all of them and incorporate them into the game in a meaningful way. Like the whole bounty mechanic is really just there because it's, oh man, we want to have some bounty hunting in it, but like we don't really have to cram it into the story-based like action game. So here it is. You can get bounties and levels as collectibles, basically. And it's kind of funny. Like I really enjoyed doing it in the first level just because of how goofy of a mechanic it was. It was kind of funny. Basically you're just abducting random people on the street. Very goofy execution. But I think it really wears off by the end to the point where it really is just no different than getting any other collectible. I don't think it's really worked into the gameplay very well. And this kind of goes for a lot of the mechanics. You kind of don't need to use the full arsenal, and the game kind of makes it hard for you to just really cycle through them all a lot. You kind of really, in any given fight, you really need to stick to a couple things. But even despite that, I still enjoyed my time playing, and not just for nostalgia reasons. I found, honestly, like, the platforming to be quite decent, and I found that the levels were, by and large, fairly interesting, some of which I did not like. Looking at you, Coruscant Industrial District, that was not enjoyable. But the rest of it, by and large, fairly good. I think it's a fun Star Wars story for the time. It's cool kind of seeing, and as a Star Wars fan, it has some cool moments, like hearing Corey Burton, Count Dooku before the Clone Wars. I recall seeing one of the early cutscenes and being like, wow, I mean, that's just Clone Wars Dooku. Like, well before the show. Very cool. They got Tamira Morrison to voice Jango in this game, which is awesome. But that sort of made a big difference, I think, for me. And also the quality of the game. The fact that they had such a good voice cast, I think, was great. I believe Zam is also the voice actress from Attack of the Clones, too. I think that kind of keeps you going for a lot of the game, even despite some of the silliness. And now, before I just go ahead and recommend this game, I think this game is really fun to play through if you played it as a kid and enjoyed it, or if you're just a diehard Star Wars fan. I think it's good fun. You're going to get a kick out of the game's story and out of the gameplay, and you're going to enjoy the experience as a whole. Now, if you're not a huge Star Wars fan, I do think this game might miss the mark. But that's kind of the nature of this way of doing things for Star Wars games. Because not every one game is going to be a massive hit and going to make $1 trillion and have more broad appeal. Now, the next game I want to talk about is sort of a weirder one compared to the other ones, which I feel like illustrate my point very clearly. I feel like Force Unleashed is a weirder one in that sense. This game was not a low-budget game, and while it does have a gimmick, and I think it executes on that well, and kind of still, I think, fits the archetype, they spent a lot of money on these games. And I think this is mostly because of the fact that really, The Force Unleashed is a multimedia project, in that there's like 3 different Force Unleashed games among the systems. Like, as a child, I played through the PS2 version, which it would be the same as the Wii version. So if you grew up with the Wii version, that's the same version. And it is a fairly different game, both in the story presentation than the Xbox 360, PS3, PC versions of the game. It's a very interesting dynamic. And I don't want to get fully into this. There are entire videos you can find on YouTube that cover all the differences between all of the Force Unleashed versions, and there are a lot. So, the main gimmick, though, with the Force Unleashed is the Force abilities, really, and the destruction mechanics, and using them to interact with the environment and with enemies. And the reason why I say I don't think there is a definitive edition of this game is because I think both versions, I'll say, really do one thing better than the other, but not the other. Like, I enjoy the combat in the PS2, and I think overall, it's a more balanced experience, that game. However, the gameplay is not, I just think, moment to moment, not as fun as the PS3, Xbox 360 version. I had so much fun replaying it. You can just kind of like fling people off the map. Like, it kind of fulfills that power, like Star Wars power fantasy, in a way that there really no other game kind of does. That where you can kind of just whoop major ass. Like, the game is like not super duper hard. It's got some cool combos you can do if you spend the time, similar to like it's kind of like a Devil May Cry, Bayonetta Light, like hack and slash type of game. I don't think it's nearly as deep as those games, or as fun as far as the combat system, but I think it makes up for it with the goofy force powers, to where it holds its own fine. But it's fun just blasting open a wall with the force. It's fun just flinging like explosive objects at people, or throwing them off the map, or like playing bowling with a group of enemies where you just grab one and just fling them into a group of enemies and they all fall over and ragdoll. I mean, it's just fun. And I think they nailed that aspect of the game, and that's sort of missing. Like, you get a shred of it in the PS2 Wii version, but I don't think it's the same level of fun. But I think the story and pacing is so much worse in the Xbox 360 and PS3 version, and also just the world building and fitting it into, at the time, the Star Wars Legends kind of canon. And it's a shame, because I kind of think if you hybridized both games, you'd have actually like a really amazing game. And instead, we have 2 very good games. A bit of a rant on The Force Unleashed, I realize. A tad off topic. I don't think it would be one of my videos if I didn't go crazy off topic on a tangent about... I guess it's not totally off topic, but still, I got on a tangent. Anyways, the game kind of ends right when you're kind of like, okay, I think I figured everything out, and I think I've kind of had enough. I don't see them throwing anything new at me as far as like puzzles and ways to use all the abilities, and then it sort of ends. And I think that's good. I think it's not a great example in the budget department. I think a more focused vision for the game, and not making 90 versions for 90 different consoles. Again, these are all things that I think are just a product of the time, and what people wanted the game to be. Because I know The Force Unleashed went through a lot of iterations. It took them a while to get the game cranked out the way that it is now. But I think it still follows the same formula enough to where I thought it was worth mentioning in this video. So I'm going to also make another comment. Star Wars Squadrons fans, before you go destroy me, I'm sure there are some of you around there, dozens of you even. I am aware of that game. I did some research on the game, and I wasn't able to see the budget and sort of how the game did. I know it sold a good bit over 1 million copies, which I think is fairly good, given if the budget was what I'm kind of picturing in my head. But I wasn't able to see what that looked like, However, that general idea of taking a simpler concept or something novel in the Star Wars universe and making a game out of it at a smaller scope, but really interesting, lower the price because it's $40 on release. That's exactly what I'd like to see going forward. In conclusion, I feel that Star Wars games are in a fine spot. I mean, the Jedi games are fantastic, but I would really like to see some fun ideas again, like we were cranking out. And it may be that ship has sailed, and we may never get Star Wars games like that again because of the relationship with Disney as opposed and game studios as opposed to LucasArts' approach. It may be just a pipe dream to think that there's any kind of change that might happen, but I think it would be really cool to see for the franchise. We could get some really cool Star Wars games out of it. That's all I really have to say. So, yeah, thanks for watching. I think this is kind of my second attempt at all this. I tried to take some criticism from my last video, both external and just stuff that I noticed myself, and tried to compile this up into what I think is a more focused video topic and a little smaller, so it should be, I think, a little easier to keep it on track, if you will, and a little less rambly. So I'm really curious to see what everyone thinks. If you've watched to this point, obviously, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch to this point. Please leave any criticism down in the comments below on this video, because it really helps, and I do read it all. Not that there's not much of it right now, but I do read it all. I'd really like to get better at doing this, because I'm enjoying myself doing it right now. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, hopefully.